All right, we're back from the holidays. It's been a minute. You guys got to listen to some old favorites the past 2 weeks, but now we're back. And today I pulled Laura on to talk a little hitting some general concepts, but then we're going to get into some hitting. This is also a day that we will kind of stop after we talk about some general concepts, and we are going to record a little bit of extended stuff to go through some biomech reports from a hitter that have some ground reaction forces as well. And so we'll share a screen at that point, and that will go up on the OGX community this week. So it's going to be a good episode. We're going to talk generally about, we've been referencing, and you and I a couple months ago had a little conversation about force plates and pitching, but we thought we would just talk through, as we're getting more force plate data, just a little bit of kind of, I think, even what we mean by force plates, because that seems like we make the assumption that when we say force plates, we're all meaning the same thing. And sometimes we've had some references for different types of force plates, both in kind of what they measure or their use, and then also things that are more like pressure mats and what the benefit or sort of like purpose of those would be. So maybe just to start, Laura, walk through the difference. So we use force plates now kind of in two different ways. So maybe walk through force plates when we're talking about things we might be measuring from a performance standpoint. So during the swing or during the pitch, force plates versus force plates that we might use from a sort of high performance or strength standpoint. What does that look like? What are the differences of those when we're talking about kind of those two separate force plate concepts?
Yeah, the biggest difference outside of cost, obviously, is how many axes does the force plate measure. So typically force plates that you might see in a weight room that are related more to like strength and conditioning or high performance, they're kind of like your bathroom scale. They're only going to measure up. They're only going to measure the vertical part, but they're instrumented, meaning that they, collect that data. You can have repeat collections. It's not the little like, digital screen that you might see on a scale or non-digital screen on a scale. But that would say they output to something else, but they're only typically going to measure, and I don't even know I have examples of anything beyond just the vertical. In the more high performance realm, again, the majority of them are only going to measure force that's created up. So a lot of the tests that you see that are utilized with those force plates are about vertical, right? They're about the vertical direction. So you might change the body around. Maybe you have them, not just direct their center of mass up for a test. You might tinker with that, but most of the outputs that come from and they're built in with these force plates and the companies that have them, they're only vertical. So we're getting things like your vertical height, your RSI, your reactive strength index, but they're only going to be in the vertical direction. So they're uniaxial is really the biggest difference. And that means that their price point essentially is a lot lower because it's simply just, that one direction that it can measure. Again, it's very useful. It's just that's the context for those force plates in the high performance realm. What you might see connected to motion capture in more of like a academic research lab, or even built into some facilities, there are a much higher price point. So force plates that are about measuring three-dimensional ground reaction forces, they obviously have a much higher price point, and they're also a lot larger. So because of that, maybe we're trying to cover a stride in hitting or in pitching. What we've got in the UNO lab is 5 force plates. It's a lot. And so that's not an easy setup. But in order to capture everything under the feet in all directions, you sometimes have to put those force plates together to be able to do that. So oftentimes their surface area is a lot larger because people are moving laterally, they're moving forward and back on them. So that's what else also increased the cost, is that you're opening up options to move in other directions because those force plates can measure not just up and down, they can measure, anterior, posterior, so forward and back if I'm the pitcher, catcher to me, and side to side. And so you have to have a little wider surface area if you want those movements, so that, athletes can obviously have more room to move on them. Now, those price points are pretty significant because of that. But the main difference essentially is like, how many components of the ground reaction force can that force plate measure? What you'll see in the strength room, what you'll see for high performance is typically uniaxial. It's vertical. It's a very, very fancy instrumented bathroom scale, right? Again, doesn't mean it's not useful, but that's essentially what it is. And then you have the more complex ones that are used in conjunction with motion capture, whether that's marker-based or marker-less, that are going to be about being able to represent all 3 dimensions of that ground reaction force. And so there's a significant difference in the information that you get out of that. It's why those tests in high performance are all vertical.
Right.
So, we spend a lot of time looking at the data from those types of force plates. Lots of colleges have them. And I think it's always really critical that we are very clear that we're talking just vertically,
Yep.
right? And in sport, obviously we don't just move vertically. We have components of all three dimensions of movement, but that those tests are very specific to vertical, and that we can extrapolate some things. We can infer some
Yep.
things about someone's vertical force and their RSI and their vertical, jump distance. We can infer some things. They're not poor measurements of, performance by any means. But I also think it's really important that we separate that conversation, because sometimes people will say, oh, well, we've got force plates in the weight room. I'm like, they're not the same force plates of what would be in a motion capture lab. It just isn't. They're different. So it's basically how much of the ground reaction force can you collect? Is it uniaxial, which is typically vertical, or is it triaxial, and you can have all three of the components of the ground reaction force represented from that force plate?
Maybe talk through too, because I don't think many people think like, a more basic pressure pad is the same as a pressure mat is the same as force plates, but there are getting, I think, some higher quality pressure mats on the market where you can kind of pull that data and you can look at that. But maybe walk through the difference, because we have had, people say, well, we have, force plates for hitting or pitching, and they really are referencing a little bit more of some version of a pressure mat. Maybe walk through what that type of thing measures as different from obviously what we're talking about when we're talking about force plates.
Yeah, it's a great one. When we're measuring ground reaction forces, when we say force plates, that's what we mean by, the data that comes from that is a ground reaction force. Ground reaction forces have two components. They have a magnitude, how much they are, and they have a direction, right? Where they're pointing, how they're oriented essentially in space. That's why, again, the vertical one is a little easier, because you just know everything's going to go up. A pressure mat is a little different. So pressure is just simply force over area, right? So what we're looking at under the feet then is more just about magnitude, but also not necessarily direction, but magnitude under specific aspects of the foot. So it's not going to tell us essentially the sort of sum total of how the body's ground reaction force is reacting with the ground. We won't get that component. But what we can see, though, is pressure under the feet. We can infer some things between the two, but they're really two separate concepts. We might see, okay, well, as you transition maybe from, your coil out of your coil and into your front side, that the pressure underneath your foot changes from your heel to toe, or, outside by your pinky toe to inside by your big toe. It's going to give us that sense under that foot, but it's not necessarily a representation of the entire body, which is what we're going to get from a force plate. So there's information. It's still a little limited compared to a ground reaction force. It's not valuable, but it is a little limited. We're just getting an understanding of essentially, kind of the foot's, how much pressure, how much force they're putting on there, but just over an area, not necessarily the direction it's heading or the ability to kind of get the whole body involved in that. It's more just this localized idea of how is your center of mass shifting underneath your feet. We can get that concept both in force plates and the pressure mats, but the pressure mats are just going to be a little limited in really being able to get all of that force concept about the entire body under with clarity, right? We're just getting that pressure that goes underneath each foot. So it's some information. Again, it's useful, right? That's what you have. You make use of it, and it can help you understand how force is transitioning between not between feet, but it could be between feet, underneath one foot relative to the other. Ground reaction forces are typically centered at a center point on the segment, if we're getting very specific. We don't always know how that ground reaction force is shifting under the foot. We just know the total sum of it, essentially. And so there are some differences between them, for sure. Both useful.
Yeah, I think it's interesting too, because I just go to with all of this, and obviously we talked about this when we talked on our podcast, a couple months ago about the pitching side, is that I also think it's so interesting with something like a pressure mat. And again, it's not to say it's not useful, but if you're not comparing that to sort of the expectation in a swing, let's say, of where pressure should be, and we're making the assumption that we want the full foot on the ground or the back, or we want this, or, whatever that means. I think I just always caution with sort of those types of things of what ultimately we're going for when we don't have normative ranges of what the expectation is, because you can make some guesses of what you think it should look like, but how do you know, essentially? Like how do you know if it should look like that? Because we see the same thing on the on the force plate side, and it's led to us being cautious of kind of what we're expecting to see, and just kind of leading where we've seen people say like, okay, well, more force into the ground is good, but sometimes, and actually the example we're going to show with the hitter today, they have a lot of force into the ground on their front side, but the way that that's transitioned into and sort of what that ultimately does to posture and sort of bat path and things like that is not great. And so you can't just be like more good. It's also about the interplay of how they got into that and what it looks like and the timing of that and
How quickly,
how quickly, where it came from. Did I just slam into the front side versus did I hold the back side? And that's really what some of the things that we'll see with this hitter. The other thing is right now for hitters, and the thing that we're going to show is that we do have the ability to kind of see it over time and some of the things that we're doing with driveline, but right now it's still against baseball norms, and that will change as we gather more softball data on the force plate side, because we have enough on the mocap side by a lot to show that from the softball side. But so then it's like, well, okay, as we always do, like let's caution that we can see the general shapes and understanding of the timing and when things should be peaking and going down at the different sort of like, vertically, medial, that type of thing. But can we assume that a softball player is going to put as much force into the ground as a baseball player? Probably not. It depends. It's going to depend on weight and different things. And so interestingly for this hitter, which we're going to look at for the community part, she does actually match baseball. And so again, is that good or bad? I don't know. We're going to get to that part. So, so we are starting to understand those things against the normative ranges, and you can start to see, I think that's the important part as we've of reference of really understanding not just how much during a swing, but also understanding the transition of timing. Also understand, when do we want to transition vertically versus medial? When do we want to be sort of doing all of that? And then ultimately the important part of that is, what is that? And we've talked about this, telling you of what's happening as a result of that. When someone loses the force they're putting on the backside, there's going to be posture implications to that, right? Because now the sort of like the trunk is going to not sort of have the stability is not the right word, but they're going to make some compensations for that, and there's going to be breakdown. And so we want to see the interplay of all of those things together. So that sort of like the maybe simplification that we've had in the past of like, we want more on the front side. That certainly is like, we can't just slam on the front side. That is so far down in the story that we don't want to go into that. But also this understanding of, okay, your posture, we've been able to make implications with our sort of understanding and inferences without the force plates in the past of, well, your posture is breaking down because we can see that you're starting to lose the backside early. And so we go back, and now we can see this really clear picture of, here's where you lose the backside. Here's the result of the posture. And actually, maybe sometimes you make it up for the front side, but that doesn't matter because we're too late down the chain for what you're able to do. So I think that story is really interesting. And it's just like, you can't, as we've always said, you can't cut off any of the pieces. You can't just look at ground reaction forces and make full assumptions of the implications.
It can't be in isolation. That's right.
Right. Because if I lose the ground and Sally loses the ground and maybe they look very similar, the result of that and how I then compensate for that are going to be different, because we have different bodies and we have different compensations. We have different rotational capacity. We have different stability. Like there's so many things that factor into then the ultimate like upstream impacts of that, all the way in the swing to the bat. We each might do something different from a posture standpoint to adjust for that. And then certainly then maybe we even do the same thing from a posture standpoint, but then we see in hitting that could then result in different compensations in the bat path. And so, we have to understand this whole, and then the bat path is ultimately what impacts the ball flight. So these pieces all are kind of going off of each other, and this isolation, I think that is a little bit of, I think a pressure mat might have some positive implications. I think I would be cautious of using it because it just seems so isolated to me from the rest of the story. And maybe if you can kind of put it together with the rest of the story, you can, but it just, to me, seems like you just really don't know just because they come off the foot or, that type of thing of what ultimately that's telling you. And so I think that's been my caution of like, I don't know if that has the exact help that we maybe think it does in the measurements of things.
NFCA 25 is just around the corner. If you're going to be on Vegas, stop by and see us. We're going to be at booths 224 and 226. Whether you just want to chat, get discounts on products, enter in to win free giveaways, we hope to see you there. Or just keep a lookout. Even if you're not going to be in Vegas during that week, we're always offering discounts, celebrating NFCA. So you'll have an opportunity to take advantage of that, whether you're in Vegas or not. Hope to see you there.
I think even in the most advanced motion capture labs, it can't. None of those things can sit in isolation. It's why we've, I'm going to talk about pitching for a second, but it's why we've railed so hard for and against the concept of motion capture without ball flight. It's the same concept. You can't look at those things in isolation. You've got to know and need to at least connect. Okay, what did the body do, and then what was the result? Now, if we're talking about a pressure mat and understanding, okay, when bucketing athletes essentially, I think that's what a pressure mat can help you do, is to bucket athletes into, okay, it seems like this person struggles medial to lateral, getting from, let me say lateral to medial, going from the outside, my pinky side of my back leg to the, getting into the inside of my big toe and like pronating on my arch. And if somebody struggles with that, my first question is, have you ever sprained your ankle? Right? It's always my first question. So you have ankle instability, right? Somebody has significant ankle instability on that back leg. It's going to alter their pressure. So we've got to tread cautiously with that. And everybody does that a little differently. Walking is such a unique signature to everybody just based on how we're built. And I think what you then have to go back to is, okay, well, if someone does this really well, does it lead to a result that matters? That's the ultimate question.
Right. I don't know if you know this answer, but what if I can not put full force of my foot into the ground and still produce good force vertically?
Happens all the time.
We don't know, and so I think that's the thing about the pressure mat is like, well, how do you know that they aren't able to still have good force? Because we're not measuring the force they're putting into it. So we don't, like, an athlete might have extreme force and they just can do it in a way that, has a little bit more of this sort of like not full foot thing. I don't know the answer to that yet. But I think that's the concept, is without measuring, yes, but what is that ultimately doing? Is she putting force into the ground while she's making this transition? It was like, for the longest time, people were, and we have a little bit of this when we see athletes kind of like sliding into the front side. And maybe this will be the next hitting one, because we have had some good examples of that lately, where athletes have lost the backside pretty early. And then what they ultimately do is they don't have a lot of force. So they need time to gain stability. So they sink into this front side and they get it somewhere else. A lot of time that's from like an arm bar. They kind of like, they get the stability that they lost in the ground from their upper body. And we see this a lot. But this idea that, we had this feeling, I think, that we should just kind of land straight down on the front side. And when you actually watch hitters, like if you just zoomed in on their front side, there is this rolling that happens of how, because during the rotation, they don't just slam on their front side. And so, but they still obviously put a lot of force into the ground. And so I think it's just an understanding of how all of those interplay and that people can do it different. And we're just trying to understand, really, the forces are the thing that tells the main story. And like we said, the transition of the different axes of that and the understanding the overall time that happens in the swing, I think is the interesting story that comes of it. What are the other things maybe that you think, as we get more of this data, we've talked a little bit about this, that we're going to be able to piece together, or maybe better than we have? We've been making sort of inferences about it. It's fine if you also say pitching, but maybe on the hitting side.
That's the only context I have for force plates right now is just on the pitching side. I look forward to digging into that on the hitting side. I think in general, understanding impulse, I think that's something that we get from the force plates. We can't get that with, we can get vertical impulse, obviously, from the high performance force plates, but from a triaxial standpoint, understanding, impulse is essentially how much force do you create over time, right? So it's your change of your force over this time period. And so you can achieve the same value of impulse, let's call it 20, for example. You can achieve the same value of impulse by having high force over a short period of time. Or you can say, I'm going to say I have a lot of time to be able to do this, and only put a little bit of force force in the ground. And so it's understanding the impulse that gets created and then what's the breakdown. It's basically a concept of like force velocity, right? Is really what we're getting at. And I think impulse from pitching, I think it's a huge component. I think that's something we're going to dive into a ton here in the coming months of impulse and what that looks like between stride foot and dry foot. And I think anytime we're talking about force and applied over time, we're obviously talking about power, right? And so it's some of these kind of smaller sort of sub metrics of this global strength of the body of how do you actually transition between the feet, right? And the feet are important. They are our connection with the ground. It's what gives us the feedback, the equal and opposite feedback of when I put something in the ground, this is what I get back from it. It's consistent. It's a known thing to push against. So it's very important that we understand the feet. But I do think impulse, I can see value in a pressure mat and like that kind of a concept as we're understanding how vertical pressure changes underneath the foot. But I think we have to get into a little bit more directionally and multi-directionally, which is why those triaxial force plates are a big deal. But again, the biggest challenge is they're so cost prohibitive. They're so expensive. And I think something that I value so much about the work that we do, and obviously with our work with Driveline, is we spend so much time trying to make things simpler for the community. Meaning, we will absorb the cost of our equipment and of all of the tech and all those things so that we can investigate, okay, well, if this one particular metric seems to be pretty related and predictive of velocity, for example, exit velocity, bat speed, whatever, then can we get that to the coaches who don't have access to all of that stuff, right? If there's something we can infer from all of our, equipment and technology that helps coaches to be able to do things in the field better, that's ultimately what we're going for. And so I think there's a difference between just like having force plates in your facility and saying we use force plates, and then actually taking the additional step of saying, but what actually matters? What are the measurements that actually mean something? How do they connect to actual performance? That's really the next step that we often take. We have to take, because that's what we're often hunting for, is how do these forces, how do the things that we get from these force plates, how do they help us to be more efficient in understanding what the hitter is doing? That's the goal. Just measuring magnitude isn't enough. We've got to know how things are changing, which is why I mentioned impulse. But we have to know how those things are changing. That's the important piece, not just how much overall do you produce.
Right. I was thinking of I think just kind of to summarize the general concept, I think I just did a sort of athlete meeting yesterday and talked through some of this. And I think the way they all interplay and why it's interesting is that this was an athlete who, with force plates on the high performance side, was a lower strength kid and a high power kid, which is not that common we see. And I always say, like, it's honestly, as long as you want to train, it's a good profile to have, because then, you go in the strength floor, you start loading things up and you get that stability. But what was interesting then for that athlete is that she had extreme breakdowns in posture and force in her sort of assessment from the swing standpoint. So this is a high power kid who had very low ground reaction forces. That shouldn't be the case, right? Because she showed vertically that she's capable of putting a lot of force into the ground, except when you are not strong and you do not have stability. That is a very hard thing to do in a swing that is this very coordinated thing and requires a lot of transition. So yes, if we just stood on one leg or two legs and we just didn't move and we just swung, she would probably have shown high force. But the requirement of stabilizing that force in the swing, everything broke down for her. And then that led to posture changes and it led to all of that. So the story for that athlete is get in the weight room. You have this ability to have high force. We can't just, and should we see the ground reaction forces increase for her? Absolutely. But we can't just say like, hey, hold the ground longer because you're losing it. She can't right now. She needs to be strong. And so you can look at all of these pieces, and also the reason her posture breaks apart the way it does a lot. Can we do some things in her swing to be sort of supplementing what she's doing in the strength floor? Absolutely. There's some like changes that I think she could make, and we talked through those. But her swing right now, the posture breakdowns that happen are a direct result of a kid that has some good power, but then can't stabilize it. And so what happens, all of that is if you break down. And so you can start to put together these pieces for the athlete. And ultimately, as you said, that's what we're trying to do, which is what's the thing to go after for that kid? The number one thing you should go after right now is to get in the weight room. I can tinker all I want with your swing, and we will do a little bit of that, but it's only going to have so many results for you. And that's not everyone's story, right? That's a big part of most teenage stories, is like go to the weight room. And that's a big piece, but that's not everyone's story. Yeah, and eat. But that gives us a clear picture. And that's really that dad actually was like, how'd you get into this? And I was like, for exactly what we just did. Because for us, it felt like, there's so much guessing for each athlete of what we're doing. And as you start putting together more and more of these pieces, now, did I at this point, and this is kind of what you're saying, need every bit of that? Could I have made a very educated inference of what that athlete needed based on not having force plates, let's say, and seeing sort of what happened with her posture and seeing that she's a high power kid? Could I have measured power in a way that maybe isn't force plates, right? We do broad jumps, we do med ball throws. And that's really the work we're trying to do, which is the best version of it, of course, is force plates for high performance. Force plates,
full motion capture and force plates and all of it. Yeah.
You're going to get so clear on it. You're not having to jump hoops to make inferences. But can we simultaneously be looking up like movement quality that we do instead of sort of the force plates? Can we be looking up med ball throws that do correlate with how we measure power? Can we start to understand when this happens in the force plates, this is what happens from a posture standpoint? So if we could see that posture, we can make some inferences of what's happening in the ground force. Right. Can we start to put together all of those pieces in a way that I'm a coach where I'm like, I'm not getting force plates for my hitters. It's just not going to happen. But I can start relying on some of the information we've been gathering. And that's the work we've been doing forever, because that's the reality. I have a 15-year-old athlete, and maybe once she can get into our gym and we can get that full story, but she might not be able to do it all the time. It might not be feasible for her to get to the places this is offered. And so how can we still be tracking progress and make some inferences that we would be expecting to see in the assessment, the full assessment? And that's really the story. So absolutely, if you can get to a place where you can get all this measured, I think is your answer. But if you can get to a place where you can get all of the measured, that's amazing. And the story is very clear. And we know that. Even for us, we prefer all that information because the story is clear. But can we keep putting information out from our group, which we've been working on, of what are other ways and more sort of accessible ways that we can be monitoring the same thing? And I think that's why we're trying to learn all of the pieces. And so we want to understand the whole story, because understanding the whole story gives us sort of like, okay, we could tackle this way. We could measure this way. This is something we could get virtually that will help us. And it just, like you said, makes it more accessible. And that's ultimately the goal.
Yeah, so we do with our college partners all the time. Every school has unique circumstances. Not every school is an SEC school with a full tilt of every single gadget and doodad that exists in our game. Right. And so much of what we do with our college partners is meeting them where they're at from a equipment standpoint, an access standpoint. What can they invest in? Can we guide them on what would be best to invest in first? Like if they're saying, hey, we've got money for this versus this, we can guide them on, hey, we think for your situation, knowing what we know about, that particular technology and the struggles that you typically, or that your program typically has, whatever, we recommend this. But it's also about helping them continue to develop their athletes with what they have available, right? We don't sit back and say, well, everybody has to have motion capture and force plates, right? Even when we talk about, schools implementing launch pads, Florida State baseball having theirs implemented, South Carolina here soon, like there are still incomplete components of those stories without the force plates. But we are now at a point where, because we know this story, we can say, okay, we can make these inferences. And for schools that can't invest in all of that technology, use the broad jump, use a trunk throw, right? We try to validate essentially these more coach-friendly and field-friendly methods of data collection so that it is accessible, right? We can't sit around and wait for every program in the country to get, again, a full, motion capture lab with force plates. It'd be great, but that's just not reality. And so there always needs to be this sliding scale of low tech to high tech. I think it's something that we do very well. I don't know if we ever intended to do this, but we do it very well in helping, our college partners especially, but the coaching community understand, hey, listen, you may not have the perfect system. Most people don't have the perfect system. Let's help you leverage what you do have and what things you're willing to collect. And it's okay if it's not the best. We can help you determine if it's valid and useful. Right. And so I think there's so much work to go, obviously, as we get our hands on more technology, as we grow our technological capabilities, just to continue to validate the stuff that the coaches are going to use, because that's what ultimately matters, right? That they have confidence that if my athletes, that their broad jumps are all low, I know how to go to my strength coach and say, listen, broad jumps are a really important metric. Here's why, here's what they relate to, in primarily the pitching motion. We can talk about trunk throws for hitting, but this is what they mean. This is why it's important. There's an art to programming, of course, and to coaching in general. I don't care how you get there. We got to increase our broad jumps. We got to increase our trunk throws, because we know and can tell the coaching staff that that's important, right? So it's being able to validate the stuff that not everybody has access to. That's really what our work is being able to help the coaches community in that way.
Yeah, for sure. All right, well, we'll wrap there. Next week is strength and conditioning, live from NFCA.
Heck
and
yeah.
by live from NFCA, I think probably from people's Airbnb rooms. So sorry, it won't be us. But we are also, next week is NFCA. We're always so excited for this time of year. Vegas, not my favorite place, but that's okay. I'll suck it up to be around.
Looking forward to seeing the people there, though.
Yeah, all the softball spaces, and excited next week to be releasing some updates to some of the work we've been doing, as always. And so, a lot of big things coming, but we're going to jump on. We're going to stop. We're going to restart here for our OGX community. So if you're part of the OGX community, great. This will come out on Wednesday of next week. If you are, or sort of Wednesday, I guess, following when we release the podcast, if you are not part of OGX community, it's just a place that you can subscribe to. We go in there, we do regular posts too. We give these sort of extended things. And it's also, it's two-way communication. So if you're part of OGX community, it's a good place where you're like, I've been doing the plyo course for a while, but I have these specific questions, or,
please ask questions.
Hitters.
Please.
Yes. And then, all of our staff is in there and engaging, and that's kind of the place for it. So that's what the OGX community is that we reference. You can get to that from our website if you want to join. But we're going to go ahead and stop for today. And until next time.